You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're here on the unceded traditional territory of the Salish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. This is Bernadine Fox, here with my co-host for the week, Don Wright, bringing you Both Sides Now. Welcome to our show. I'm Bernadine Fox.
And I'm your co-host, Don Wright.
And this is Both Sides Now. Whether you're at home prepping your dinner or on your car driving home, settle in for our conversation with Frank Cohn, Executive Director from VAST, an organization here in Vancouver who works with survivors of political torture. Torture has become an overused word. It's almost commonplace to hear people use it for anything that is painful or particularly difficult to overcome. However, the definition of political torture comes from the United Nations Convention Against Torture, wherein I'm not going to give you the whole sort of complicated definition, I'm going to paraphrase it. They say that it's the intentional infliction of pain or suffering by political officials or individuals acting in official capacities that is either physical or mental and is inflicted to obtain information or a confession or as punishment or as a means of intimidating or coercing a victim. The definition provides parameters which are not common in the daily lives of most of us here in Canada. So unless you've grown up in a cult which also uses some sorts of the same kinds of techniques to induce compliance in their memberships, you probably have not run into this. Today, we're going to talk about political torture. So to begin, I want to warn folks that in this hour, we may talk about specific forms of torture that include emotional, physical, and sexual violence. And this might be difficult material for you, and if so, we ask that you do what you need to take care of yourself. So today, as I mentioned, we're here with Frank Cohn from VAST. Thank you for coming, Frank. Tell us what VAST stands for.
Sure, yeah, and thank you for having me. VAST is the Vancouver Association for Survivors of Torture. We've been around since 1986. In the 1980s, there was generally in Canada and around the world a movement of survivors of torture who were forming organizations as activists based around the work being done on the UN Convention Against Torture and what is called the right to rehabilitation for victims survivors of extreme violence.
I had not heard of the right to
rehabilitation.
Boy, I don't have a mouth today. Anyway, so what is that?
Yeah, so it's essentially stating that when an individual ends up in a different country, which is usually when, it's very interesting, for whatever reason, the survivor of torture movement globally has tended to focus almost entirely on migrants, so people who are crossing borders, and that tends to be the primary focus of the movement. It doesn't often account very well for domestic survivors of torture, of which there are less, but also often many, and any is too many. Right. And I forgot your question, I'm sorry.
What is the right to rehabilitation?
Right, the right to rehabilitation. So it refers to when an individual does cross into another country, and any country that is a signatory to the UN Convention Against Torture is essentially saying that we will accept individuals who are survivors as refugees, in as much as we would be accepting refugees anyways. And for those who are survivors, we acknowledge that these individuals have healing work that they need to do, have recovery work that they need to do, and that there are resources required for that. And so we are essentially saying as countries that we agree to the individual's right to rehabilitate from the violence that's been inflicted on them.
That's interesting. I didn't know that part.
Yeah, most people
that's good.
don't know.
Yeah.
I did not know anything about this field until I started working in VAST almost 3 years ago. And so it's been a very steep learning curve for me. And just to share as well, I myself am not, I represent the organization, but I'm not a survivor myself. I am blessed to work with an incredible number of survivors who have been through horrific challenges and who have emerged as strong leaders, vocal people, and who carry with them ideas and solutions. And so I'm lucky to be in this position, working with those people and representing their voices today.
It sounds like a wealth of information. What is the purpose of torture? Like, I had a nice little definition, but why do public officials, why do governments torture people?
That's a big question. It goes back to human nature. I think it's questions of control and questions of fear and questions of ego. I think we, as humans, torture in order to instill fear in not just one other, but in a group of others. So a key component of the definition of torture is that it is based on some aspect of your identity or the identity group that you belong to, whether you're a political minority, a religious minority, somebody with from a non-dominant cultural group, somebody who is speaking out against an existing group, somebody who ends up on an LGBTQ person, somebody with a disability, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that when institutions commit acts of violence, acts of torture against individuals from a group, part of what they're hoping for is that fear will spread to the rest of the group and to society overall. And so they'll be somehow able to control society in a way and craft it more towards their liking or towards their value system, which often involves a lot of selfishness.
It is true that fear is a powerful motivator. And fear of being hurt and being hurt really badly is an incredibly powerful motivator. Yes.
I'm also thinking that people that engage in committing torture must have some kind of twisted joy in perpetrating that kind of behavior. I mean, how can you do that if you don't get some kind of ego boost out of or enjoyment? I mean,
orders.
Yeah.
People are often following orders, right? And of course that is no excuse ever. But just in terms of looking at the psychology of it, it may not be their joy as much as it's their superior's joy. And they are the peon, they are the instrument of somebody else. And so a lot of soldiers, a lot of, even medical staff, or, looking at other institutions, schools and religious institutions as well. There's often a tone that's set or even a mandate that's given of how to treat certain groups, certain people. We have had that in our country as well, in terms of survivors from residential schools, Indigenous survivors. And, but, yeah.
Isn't it also true, though, that even if you are somebody who's employed by the public official that is committing these things, by watching other people being tortured, you yourself would end up in fear that if you don't comply, you would also experience something just as bad. So that fear is not just filtered out to their prisoners, it's filtered out to the prison guards as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, we know that violence is often systemic in nature, and what I mean by that is that we see it at multiple levels of society, and so people may be participating in it at a certain level, following along what's happening in the rest of the culture that they're in. We know also that it's cyclical. We know that individuals who have violence inflicted against them, if they don't have an opportunity to process, to heal, to recover, and we go back to that right to rehabilitation, we know that they are more likely to, and I'm not saying that they will, but I'm saying that they may be more likely to become violent themselves,
Right.
because that's what they've been taught in terms of how to control, how to achieve what you want, how to define even your own self identity and your ego.
Well, we see that in intergenerational familial abuse, right? That it gets passed down.
So that's one thing, turning around and perpetrating the same thing that was done to you. But what are some of the other deeper effects that are a result of this?
For the survivors?
Yeah.
So we have essentially a whole catalog of trauma symptoms that we might see among survivors of torture, and anybody who does work with trauma has a sense of what we're dealing with, and it's that to an extreme. So we have a number of assessment tools that we use, developed by Harvard University, Johns Hopkins University, that are standard across the torture treatment sector. And with these assessment tools, we get a sense of how deeply has somebody been affected, how is there, but not only how deeply have they been affected, but also what are their coping mechanisms, what are their resiliencies as an individual and in the family or cultural group that they're in. And so what are the tools and resources that they have to heal from what has happened to them? So, and those resiliencies grow at the same time as the scars and damage grows.
Right.
And so we believe it's really important to look at both.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, dissociation is a very common coping tool, and yet that helps people get through difficult times.
Mm-hmm.
So where does torture occur?
So
Right now, I mean, that's a big, huge question. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, it
Right
occurs all
now,
over the world. Yeah.
Right now, where are people coming to Canada from that they've experienced torture? If we talk about it currently.
So the clients that we work with at VAST, the countries, the top countries that they're coming from are Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Mexico, Colombia. A lot of the Colombians are Venezuelan of origin, and similarly Iraqis maybe coming from elsewhere in the region. There's a lot of regional movement before the international movement, but torture certainly does occur really in so many places around the world, and depending on the type of identity group. So I don't recall the number of countries in which being gay is punishable by death at this time in 2019. It's more than 50. I wish I had the exact number in mind, but it's more than 50, and these countries are in Africa, in Asia. And while they're not in some other places, while it may not be punishable by death in some other places, it certainly makes life untenable for people and unsafe.
Yes. Yes, we're just going to take a little break there, and but we'll be right back with Frank from VAST.
Looking for a show that promotes compassionate living with respect for all beings on Earth?
Animal Voices is Vancouver's and Western Canada's only animal advocacy and vegan radio program.
Bringing you all the animal and vegan-related news, events, interviews, lifestyle, and commentary you need to keep up to date on what's happening both locally and internationally.
We at Animal Voices encourage the movement toward a world in which animals are treated with compassion and mercy.
So please do tune in every Friday from noon to 1 p.m. on 100.5 FM, and remember to be kind to the animals.
Don't listen to the people who think they know it all. I open my heart and write you a song. Time is gone, escape from all, and in the grave you can live, on the trees you can slip, and the moon will make you smile, and the city says goodbye, and shout la 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 la. I give you my bed, oh bed, for guitar and bread. I give you my shoes, oh shoes, and I give you my hat. Time is gone, escape from all, and in the grave you can live, on the trees you can slip, and the moon will make you smile, and the city says goodbye, and shout la 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 la. And in the grave you can live, on the trees you can slip, and the moon will make you smile, and the city says goodbye, and shout.
Welcome back. I'm Bernadine Fox.
And I'm Don Wright.
And this is Both Sides Now on Vancouver Co-op Radio, 100.5 FM. We're here with Frank Cohn. Sorry, I always feel like I'm about to say it wrong. Who comes to us to speak with us about vast and political torture. And one of the things that I'd really like to get into, not like to get into because it's going to be a little hairy, is some idea of what is political torture. Because I think the average person doesn't have a clue, and we can add thank God after that. But I also think it's important for us to understand that our fellow man, woman coming here from another country may in fact have dealt with these things, and to have some compassion about that. So can we talk a little bit about what that looks like? And I'm going to warn our listeners as well that this may include some graphic descriptions and may be triggering, so take care of yourself in this time. So what's the most common form of political torture that occurs?
Yeah, so...
Or is there one?
Well, humans have an incredible capacity for violence. We have an incredible capacity for love and beauty and wonderful things, but also for violence. So, unfortunately, over history, there has been a lot of creativity that has gone into figuring out how to make people suffer more and create greater fear and Some of the methods that are used today are ones that were used a long time ago. Medieval torture methods is one of the things that people think about when they think about that word, and certainly some of those techniques do still get used in different parts of the world
Like what?
against individuals. It could be anything from water-related torture,
Like drowning?
confinement, drowning, confinement in very small areas, whether just a solitary confinement that somebody might even still be able to move around in, but sometimes restrictions of limbs for extended periods of time.
Right. One of the things that I heard is that there's an inability to actually lie down completely or stand up completely or move about or sit down
Or sleep.
or sleep.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sleep deprivation is quite common. Imprisonment is quite common. Beatings, strangulation, electrocution. These are ideas that are important to name occasionally. I think more important to understand that there are individuals and sometimes groups of people out there who have suffered horrific and systematic violence, and who may be among us for a variety of reasons. The person who's driving slow in front of you, or next to you in the supermarket, or that you're meeting out at night. These may be people who may have experienced something because of who they were in another place.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also sexual humiliation and assault, and I know that political torture happens to men as much as it happens to women. I think also one of the things that I read was that part of the torture is threatening somebody's loved ones.
Yes.
And I think with women, it's also removing their children, or maybe you can fill that in a little bit more for me. I'm not sure I have the right notes.
No, sexualized violence is unfortunately incredibly common against women and trans people, and against men, and against children, and all different forms involving humiliation as well, and involving deprivation and being cut off from family members, or having to watch family members suffer, or
So
having
they're torturing their family members, and they're being made to watch.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply with anything that I'm sharing that this is how it happens, that this is a standard way
No.
of doing things, but essentially anything that we can imagine, unfortunately, may have happened, and the stories that we receive in VAST, and that we listen to are ones that consistently surprise and shock. I've been doing this work for just 3 years, but I am very lucky to work with colleagues who have been doing this for 16, 17 years. And I have some mentors in our sector who have been doing this for 30 years. And you'd think, well, after a few years of it, you don't get surprised or shocked anymore. And while it may be true that you don't fall off your seat anymore, and it's more so that you expect the unexpected. You expect to be surprised by a new level of cruelty or violence or degradation, and so we don't usually tend to focus on the specifics of what occurs.
Right.
And that also is related to our mandate as an organization. We don't work with people in other countries. We work with people here. We work with people once they are removed from the more imminent threats to their life,
Right.
or person. And so our work focuses on healing. It focuses on building community. It focuses on sometimes on documentation of torture, because it often is connected to an individual's legal status in the country. What has happened to them that caused them to flee? Do they have a legitimate reason to be here? And sometimes there's some psycho-legal documentation, psychological and legal documentation that is needed in order to really inform about an individual situation or a group. Sometimes it's collecting a series of testimonials from different individuals in order to understand collectively. So, diverging slightly, and feel free to bring me back with another question, but one process that VAST is participating in now, we just had here in Vancouver the Colombian Truth Commission, which is looking at the last decades of violence and displacement in Colombia. What happened? Who did it happen to? Who suffered? Which groups suffered and lost land and life? Was there a particular impact on Afro-descended groups in Colombia, on indigenous groups in Colombia, on women and we know from hearing stories over time and listening to those stories and sometimes categorizing those stories, we know more about who gets affected. We also are in a process as a sector now of learning more about who is doing the torturing. And we know that it is, for the most part, a masculine question. It is men who are conducting the violence, but we need to know more to understand better.
Is there a network, like a global network? Like you're doing your part here. Is there other organizations across the world that are also doing their part, where all this data gets amassed into one great, wonderful document that tells us lots?
So so VAST is a member globally of the International Rehabilitation Council for Victims of Torture, the IRCT. They're based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and there's over 150 member organizations around the world. We have 5 organizations in Canada that constitute the Canadian Network for Survivors of Torture and Trauma. Our national network is relatively recently formed, and VAST is playing the coordinating role in this network now. The largest center in Canada is the CCVT, Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture in Toronto. And then we also have partner centers in Montreal, in Calgary, and Victoria, and others in some other provinces that we're still exploring with, and so the IRCT serves as a somewhat of a standard-setting body for the sector, and they help to they hold a once every 2 years scientific symposium, bringing together different academics and survivors and thinkers around the topic, and building our voice around advocacy.
That's phenomenal, actually. I'm so pleased that it's actually the data is being gathered on a global
so the
level.
IRCT has an initiative now called Data in the Fight Against Impunity. And they are, a lot of the member centers in smaller or less developed, less technologically developed areas don't have data collection capacity, may not have databases, may not even have functioning internet, or a lot of the, on a border town, a group of people may have put a center together and may be serving and providing support to victims who are crossing over the border from a conflict nearby, but really may not have the technological resources to participate in something like a global data initiative. So part of what the IRCT has been doing is providing technical support to these smaller centers to allow them to participate in sharing their data as well.
Were there torture victims from Canada or the U.S.? Does that happen here and we just don't see it because we live in the land of mountains and oceans and blue sky?
And honey?
And honey.
Yes.
You mentioned the
yes.
residential schools, but I'm sure that there's other things happening, maybe more isolated, but I'm sure it's happening here too.
Yeah, so the cases of domestic modern day torture that we could refer to in a country like Canada or the US or Australia, for example, could relate to a couple of different things. Keep in mind the type of torture that we talk about is a form of organized violence by an institution that should be supporting you or protecting you. So what kinds of institutions get covered in that? Government, military, police, but also schools, hospitals. And so in Canada, we do continue a practice, much less so than our neighbors to the south, but we do continue a practice of detaining refugee claimants who cross the border. Now there may
Cross the border from the USA into Canada.
Yeah, well, across our border, which
Right.
is from the U.S. They could fly in,
Right.
but to a place like Vancouver, most refugee claimants happen to walk over the border, and some of them, when they arrive, do get detained for an unlawful, unreasonable period of time. And that detention can constitute torture depending on the conditions. In Australia, the torture treatment movement does some work to speak to the offshore detention of migrants to Australia, that the conditions are often quite brutal. But yeah, more so I think in Canada, what we have to think about as a country and what we have to think about in terms of our history is who are the institutions who have used their power to take advantage of and to commit violence against specific communities because of their identity. And so for many years, the Catholic Church, other churches in Canada, I don't want to blame just one, and the national government in collusion with the churches who would run the residential schools and who would also run the institution, the religious institution in smaller communities, would have practices of violence against Indigenous children. The 60s Scoop is another example,
Yes,
where an institution, and we know that this continues today, where Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented in the child welfare system. And, well, if they were all ending up in lovely, wonderful foster families, that wouldn't be as much of an issue. But their families are being torn apart, their communities are being torn apart, and they're ending up often in violent, abusive foster homes.
Yes.
I think there's also a lot of psychological torture that maybe goes unnoticed because it's not visible. You don't see scars, you don't see bruises, but the damage is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we talk about trauma, we talk within the refugee context. We talk about trauma happening in the country that they came from, in their journey on the way, whether it's a few weeks or even up to sometimes a few decades or generations spending in refugee camps, but also when they arrive. And a lot of individuals when they arrive here, and a lot of individuals who grow up here, do face significant discrimination based on how they look and how they present. And that does, for a lot of people, amount to some form of real psychological trauma. And it's a reality we have to look at.
We're going to take another break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk about how we can help. So stay tuned.
He's 5'2" and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic, a Hindu,
an atheist, a Jain, a Buddhist and a Baptist and a Jew. And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will kill. You for me, my friend, and me for you. And he's fighting for Canada, he's fighting for France, he's fighting for the USA, and he's fighting for the Russians, and he's fighting for Japan. And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way. And he's fighting for democracy, he's fighting for the Reds. He says it's for the peace of all. He's the one who must decide who's to live and who's to die. And he never sees the writing on the walls. But without him, how would Hitler have condemned him at Dachau? Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon to the war. And without him, all his killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. But his orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
Join us every Monday from 2:30 to 4 p.m. for She Boom. Open your ears to the sound of the latest and greatest women in music. Our show focuses entirely on female artists, from a local to global perspective. Every Monday from 2:30 to 4 p.m., tune in to She Boom on CFRO 100.5 FM, Co-op Radio.
Welcome back to Both Sides Now here on Vancouver Co-op Radio, 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox.
And I'm co-host Don Wright.
And we're here speaking with Frank Cohn from VAST, the Vancouver Association for Survivors of Torture, about what it means to have experienced political torture, to come to a whole new country and to try and put some part of your life back together. One of the things that I sort of discovered that I found kind of fascinating about torture was that it was a list of songs that the CIA used to torture people with. And where is it? What did I do with that list? It was, oh, here it is. So the songs the CIA uses to torture their prisoners is Baby One More Time by Britney Spears, Dirty by Christine Aguilera, Barney's I Love You song, and We Are the Champions by Queen. I would never have guessed any of well, Barney's song maybe I would have guessed, but the other ones absolutely not. So Frank, I want to talk a little bit more about what happens when folks get here. So they arrive, they've experienced this trauma that is probably, you know, as they're meeting people and re-socializing and everything, is probably unspeakable on some level. That there's not a lot of places that you can go and say, hey, this is what happened to me, right? Am I right about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are some wonderful settlement agencies in BC and Canada who play a key role in receiving these people. And VAST collaborates with those settlement agencies. So ISS of BC, Immigrant Services Society of BC, Mosaic,
Right.
Success, Options, Diversity, and a number of smaller ones as well around the province. They do a really wonderful job of receiving people and starting the process of getting them set up. And what we talk about in relation to our partnership with these other agencies is taking a trauma-informed approach to settlement and a settlement-informed approach to trauma, which means that we are understanding that when somebody comes here, no matter what they've survived on the other side or on the way, their first priority is not necessarily going to be a therapeutic healing process. Their first priority is to get their life organized, to get the work permit that they need, to get the the housing that they
Right.
need, to figure out if their family back home is safe,
Right.
to figure out if they're going to be able to eventually bring in their wife or their child or their mother here, who may be in danger elsewhere. So, and figuring those pieces out is the best psychological benefit that the person can have at the time. And so for us to work really closely to ensure that they are receiving those settlement outcomes is key. And then once we know that they're doing that, then we can first we can do some very early intervention, proactive grounding and settling work with people. So we have one group that we run called Getting Through It. We have another one that we run called Landing and Settling, and another one called Now What. And each of those groups is really focused on doing some of the early, okay, you're here now, you're in more safety now. We don't, and you are still probably experiencing different symptoms, different challenges, nightmares maybe, anxiety maybe,
Post-traumatic stress flashbacks.
Yeah, flashbacks. Maybe still some visual, auditory hallucinations. It could be, trauma presentations for different people can be quite different. But what we like to do is try to normalize and say, what you're experiencing doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. Doesn't mean that you have done something wrong. Doesn't mean that you're sick or that you're problematic
Or crazy.
What it means or crazy. What it means is that you are having a normal, healthy reaction to a very abnormal thing that has happened to you. And you're amongst a community of people right now who can support you in healing and recovering.
I would imagine that having home life, all of those things, those sort of day-to-day stuff that needs to happen for all of us, would need to, that foundation would need to be there for them to actually be able to do the therapeutic work. Am
to
I
go
right?
deeper
Yeah.
and to get further in for most people. Yeah,
Yeah,
and different people are ready at different times.
They need to feel safe, and having their own home, whatever that looks like, is going to allow them to start feeling safe finally after so long.
Yeah.
What kinds of things happen, say, in our culture here in Canada, here in Vancouver, Canada, that are problematic for folks who have come from another country and have experienced political torture? Are there certain things we do that we just don't realize, are problems, but are problems for them?
Absolutely, yeah. It could be the simplest things, from a car muffler going off to construction next door, shaking the walls of the house and reminding you of a time when you were hiding from bombs. To simpler things like that, to maybe more complex things around the types of social interactions that different people are having, and the way that anger is presented, or the way that people feel included or excluded.
Right.
Ongoing discrimination that people may experience either when applying for jobs or applying for housing, which we know from the people we work with is a huge reality that they face here, despite our feelings of Canada being such a wonderful, inclusive place. We know from the experience of people who are racialized, people who look different than the dominant cultural identity in Canada, that those are challenges, and those exclusions can be triggering for people, certainly. And
I think there can also be things like sounds, hearing someone speak the language of their torturer, or someone that looks like your torturer, or there's so many sort of ambient triggers that can set a person, throw them into a memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And related to gender as well. If your torturer was a large man, I happen to also be a rather large man, and so I have to be very careful with how and where I am in our groups, and I will never go into any of our individual therapy sessions that are occurring. If I'm going into the group, I'm careful to kind of announce myself prior and make it clear why I'm there. And authority can be very intimidating for people who have had violent experiences with authority. Yeah, and sometimes, we think about a country on the other side of the world, and we think, oh yeah, everybody in the Middle East speaks Arabic. Well, sure, maybe a lot of people do, but there's a lot of minority languages there. Mm-hmm. And so if Arabic, as you said, Don, is the language of your oppressor, and the language of the group that is doing violence to your group, and you come here to receive services, and people see, oh, you're from this country and you can understand this language, so we'll give you an interpreter with this language, and that of course can be really problematic. So the subcultural and sub-identity groups can make things really quite complex.
What about female perpetrators out there? Are there female people that are committing the political torture or are part of that? Or is that just something that's not very heard of?
I'm sure that there are. It's something that we don't hear as much of. Reality in most countries around the world is that positions of power tend to be held by men.
That's true.
And the torture that we refer to refers to abuses of power. Right. And we know also in a lot of countries that are seeing more progress around equality and around women attaining more power, that sometimes they are attaining that power within a very male-dominated patriarchal context. And so sometimes they may, as we talked about earlier in the show, may need to behave in violent ways in order to keep their job, in order to move up in their job, in order to
prove that they can do it as women in a male-dominated position.
Yeah.
Therapy, when that happens, what does that look like? Is it cognitive therapy, narrative therapy, art therapy? What kinds of therapy helps with somebody who's gone through political torture?
Yeah, so at VAST we have a team of clinical counselors and a psychiatrist and a psychologist. I'm a social worker myself by training. We have a few other social workers on the team as well. And the methods that our team uses vary quite broadly depending on where the person is in terms of their needs and depending on their cultural background and level of interest. So formal mental health services are something that we're used to here, the idea of going and talking to a therapist. In many places around the world, that is a very foreign concept. And mental health is something that may be much more dealt with on a community level or on a religious or spiritual level or on an individual family level. And so the methods that we use vary depending on that. Our entry point with a lot of clients tends to be more somatic experiencing related work. So where are you experiencing the pain or the memory or the trauma in your body? And using a lot of creative methods as well. So we have a couple of expressive arts therapists on our team who really love to get clients drawing, painting. We have kinetic sand trays that we use, and every once in a while you'll hear anything from singing to animal noises to guttural yelps coming out of our rooms or out of our group rooms. Just getting people moving and reconnecting with their bodies and recognizing where they may be holding on to some of the pain. And then when people are ready, then we do start to use other methods, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, a wide variety. So our clinicians are pretty flexible. They need to be.
They need to be. I would imagine having so many people coming from such a culturally diverse area, and the fact that I suspect political torture is very much personalized to each prisoner, right? I mean, what makes one person afraid may not make another person afraid, and so you really have to gear the treatment down to the individual in a much bigger way. If folks want to get a hold of VAST, how would they do that? What's the process of doing that?
So online, our website is vast-vancouver.ca.
So VAST is all one word?
Yep.
Dash Vancouver, okay.
.ca, and then we have an active presence on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I don't think I left any of them out. And we're listed on most of those platforms as VAST Nonprofit. And then we also currently run what's called the Provincial Refugee Mental Health Support Line. It's not a crisis line. It's just a voicemail inbox, but it's a service that we provide to other service providers all around the province who may be encountering a survivor and struggling with knowing what to do or how to work with them. And so people are from around the province call into that line. The number, I'll give it here, it's 604-588-3071. Again, that's the BC Provincial Refugee Mental Health Support Line for service providers, 604-588-3071. Also on our website, we have a referral form there. So if anybody wants to refer someone to the organization, they can just go to the website and from the website either click Make a Referral, or if you happen to have recently won the lottery, you can also click the Make a Donation button. We survive on a mix of public and private funds, and the more support that we have from individuals out there, the more flexibility we're able to have in our work to be able to serve those who really need it the most.
So does VAST itself have a phone number as well?
Yeah, 778-372-6593 is our main office.
Okay. And do people, so if somebody has been a victim of torture, can they self-referral, or do they need to be referred by somebody else to your organization?
They can and do self-refer,
Okay.
yeah. So our referrals come primarily from 3 different sources. One is law firms, one is the settlement agencies we talked about earlier, and then the third is the primary health clinics around either through VCH or Fraser Health.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for coming in. It's been a riveting hour, and I've learned a lot. So thanks for joining us
Thank you
and
for having
telling
me.
us about this important work that VAST does.
And your information is on our website, is it not?
Yes, we have a resource page, and we will make sure that all of VAST's information is on that page as well.
Well, thank you for your efforts to bring this topic to light and to make people more aware of it. And I think that makes us all better as people and more
I agree.
comfortable.
I agree.
And you know, we learn from each other.
We do. From each other, from all the people who come to Canada and live here and are here and stuff. So, yes. Okay, thank you.
Last man standing, might feel small, looking into the ocean and the vastness of it all. 12 years old, Mama's dead now. Never knew what hit her when that train came barreling down. Left home hungry, crying to God above. Why do you hate me? There's no such thing as love. Women ones, fighting like hell till that final bell. Fell in love once, Leona was her name. Her beauty was a thorn that he would never, never ever tame. Beat her till she bled, trying to break a will. One day she woke up with no more love to give. Women and guns, horses, cars, and liquor runs, fighting like hell till that final bell. Last man standing, 80 years old, crying like a baby when he saw her body cold. Last man standing, might feel small, looking into the ocean and the vastness of it all.
You're listening to Both Sides Now on Vancouver Co-op Radio 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox. Thanks to Dawn for coming and co-hosting with me this week, and to Frank Cohn from VAST for coming in and talking to us a little bit about political torture. Our music this week was by Dave Gummio, Carrie Wendell McClellan, and Buffy St. Marie. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, bothsidesnow@coopradio.org, or via Twitter @BothSidesNowBC. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights. And it's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche.